August 12, 1944. Bletchley Park, England. The fluorescent lights hummed above rows of machines clicking and whirring in mechanical rhythm. Richard Ashford sat hunched over his desk in Hut 6, his eyes bloodshot from 18 consecutive hours of work. Around him, dozens of cryptanalysts bent over their worksheets, pencils scratching against paper, typewriters clattering in staccato bursts. The air smelled of tobacco, strong tea, and the metallic tang of overheated machinery. Richard's fingers moved across the Enigma decryption worksheet with practiced precision. He was 32 years old, a Cambridge mathematician who had been recruited in 1940 when Britain was desperate for minds that could see patterns where others saw only chaos. For 4 years, he had lived in this world of intercepted messages, rotating cipher wheels, and the cold mathematics of war. He had helped break thousands of German codes. He had saved countless lives without ever firing a shot, but he had never faced what was coming. The message he was working on had been intercepted at 3:40 hours that morning from a Luftwaffe communication station in northern France. Standard military encryption routed through the Enigma machine with a daily key setting that his team had cracked 2 days earlier. Richard worked through the substitution patterns methodically, translating the seemingly random letter groups into German words, then into English. At 11:47 hours, the message resolved into clarity. Richard read it once, then again. His throat went dry. The message was an operational order for Luftwaffe 3, the German air fleet controlling operations over France. Target designation, the town of Beaumont-sur-Loire. Date, August 14, 1944. Time, 1400 hours. Mission classification, civilian infrastructure destruction. Expected casualties, high. Richard knew Beaumont-sur-Loire, a market town in central France. Population approximately 5,000. No military installations, no strategic value. Just homes, shops, a medieval church, and families who had already endured 4 years of occupation. The bombing was punitive, meant to punish the local resistance and terrorize the civilian population. He could stop it. One telephone call to the appropriate channels, and RAF fighters could intercept the bombers, or the French resistance could be warned to evacuate the town. 5,000 lives saved with a simple decision. Richard reached for the telephone on his desk, then hesitated. Something nagged at him. The message had been unusually long for a tactical bombing order. There had been additional encoded sections. Richard returned to his worksheet and began working through the secondary encoding layers. This was deeper encryption, used only for high-priority intelligence. His pencil moved faster now, scratching calculations across the paper. The other cryptanalysts around him continued their work, unaware that anything unusual was happening. Outside the window, grey English rain fell steadily on the manicured lawns and Victorian buildings that housed Britain's most secret weapon. 20 minutes later, Richard broke the secondary code. What he read made his hands shake. The additional message was a movement order for Generaloberst Erwin Dietrich, one of the highest-ranking officers in the German Wehrmacht. Dietrich was responsible for coordinating defensive operations across occupied France. He was a brilliant strategist who had personally designed the fortification systems that were making the Allied advance so costly. Intelligence estimates suggested that Dietrich's tactical decisions had resulted in thousands of Allied casualties. According to the decoded message, Dietrich would be in Beaumont-sur-Loire on August the 14th at 1400 hours, the exact time and place of the scheduled bombing. He was traveling there for a confidential meeting with local occupation commanders. His route, his security detail, his precise schedule were all laid out in the message. It was intelligence gold, the kind of opportunity that came once in a war, but it also meant that if the bombing proceeded as planned, Dietrich would die. One of Germany's most dangerous military minds eliminated without risking a single Allied soldier. The strategic value was incalculable. Richard sat back in his chair, the 2 decoded messages spread before him. 5,000 French civilians on one side, 1 German general on the other. Mathematics made the calculation simple. 1 life versus 5,000. The equation answered itself. Except Richard could not stop thinking about the children who would be playing in Beaumont-sur-Loire's Central Square at 2 in the afternoon, the shopkeepers opening their doors after lunch, the elderly women sitting on benches in the summer heat. They had names, they had families, they were not variables in an equation. Richard stood and walked to the office of Commander Edward Travis, the deputy director of Bletchley Park. Travis was a Royal Navy officer, efficient and unsentimental, a man who understood that wars were won by hard decisions. Richard knocked on the doorframe. Travis looked up from a stack of reports. Richard explained what he had found. He laid out both decoded messages on Travis's desk. He presented the situation clearly, without emotion, the way he had been trained. Travis read both messages carefully, then leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he said nothing. Outside, the rain continued falling. Travis picked up his telephone and requested a secure line to London. 10 minutes later, Richard found himself in Travis's office with 2 additional men he had never seen before. They wore civilian clothes but carried themselves with military bearing. One introduced himself only as Colonel Davies from the Joint Intelligence Committee. The other did not give a name at all. Davies asked Richard to explain the intercepts again. Richard did so, his voice steady despite the cold knot forming in his stomach. Davies and his unnamed companion exchanged glances. Then Davies asked a question that made Richard's blood run cold. Had anyone else seen these decoded messages? Richard said no. Davies nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. The unnamed man spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, cultivated, the accent of Oxford or Cambridge. He explained that the decision Richard faced was not actually a decision at all. It had already been made at the highest levels. The Prime Minister himself had established protocols for exactly this type of situation. Britain's ability to read German codes was the most valuable secret of the war. It had to be protected at all costs. If the Allies warned Beaumont-sur-Loire or prevented the bombing, the Germans would know their codes had been broken. They would change their encryption systems. Thousands of Allied soldiers would die in future operations because commanders would be operating blind. The war itself might be prolonged by months or even years. Therefore, the protocol was clear. When breaking German codes revealed information that could save lives, but would also reveal that the codes had been broken, the information could not be acted upon. The secret had to be preserved, even at terrible cost. Richard stared at the unnamed man. Surely there was another way. They could stage a random patrol that happened to spot the bombers. They could send a resistance fighter who claimed to have overheard German soldiers talking. They could fabricate any number of explanations that would not compromise the Enigma's secret. Davies shook his head. Too risky. German intelligence was sophisticated. They analyzed every Allied action for patterns, looking for signs that their communications had been compromised. Any warning to Beaumont-sur-Loire, no matter how it was disguised, would trigger an investigation. The coincidence of Allied knowledge would be too precise, too timely. The risk was unacceptable. But what about Dietrich? Surely killing such a high-value target was worth the bombing. The unnamed man smiled thinly. That was precisely why the bombing would proceed. Dietrich's death would provide strategic advantage. The loss of civilian life was regrettable but acceptable in the context of total war. And because the bombing was already planned by the Germans themselves, there would be no compromise of the Enigma secret. It were, he said, an unfortunate but militarily sound outcome. Richard felt something break inside him. He asked if he was being ordered to remain silent. Davies said yes. He asked if there was any possibility of appeal. The unnamed man said no. He asked who would be responsible for the deaths in Beaumont-sur-Loire. Travis, who had been silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "Everyone in this room," he said quietly, "and no one." Richard returned to Hut 6 in a daze. Around him, his colleagues continued their work, breaking codes, processing intercepts, winning the invisible war. He sat at his desk and looked at the decoded messages. In 36 hours, 5,000 people would die. He would have the blood of an entire town on his hands because he chose to remain silent. But if he spoke, how many more would die in the battles to come? That night, Richard could not sleep. He lay in his quarters, staring at the ceiling, running calculations in his mind. 5,000 versus how many? 10,000? 50,000? How did one measure the value of a secret against the value of lives? How did one weigh the deaths that would happen against the deaths that might happen? He thought about the mathematics of it. Expected value, probability distributions, risk assessment, the tools of his trade applied to human lives. If the Enigma secret was compromised, Allied casualty rates would increase. Historical data suggested that code-breaking intelligence reduced combat deaths by approximately 30%. If the war was prolonged by even 3 months because of lost intelligence, the additional casualties could number in the hundreds of thousands. The mathematics was clear. Sacrificing 5,000 to save hundreds of thousands was logical. It was the only rational choice, but Richard had never felt less rational in his life. The next morning, he returned to work. Other intercepts needed breaking. The war continued regardless of his moral crisis. Richard processed messages mechanically, his mind elsewhere. At lunch, he walked through the grounds of Bletchley Park, past the lake where ducks glided across still water, past the rose gardens where flowers bloomed in cheerful defiance of the war. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful. He thought about walking to the village and finding a telephone. He could call someone, anyone, warn them about Beaumont-sur-Loire. But who would he call, and what would he say? Even if someone believed him, how would they act on the information without revealing its source? The security services would trace the leak within hours. Richard would be arrested for treason. The Enigma program would be compromised anyway. 5,000 would still die, and he would have accomplished nothing except destroying the intelligence advantage that had saved so many others. That afternoon, a colleague named Margaret approached his desk. She was a cheerful woman from Manchester, brilliant with statistical analysis, always ready with tea and sympathy. She asked if Richard was feeling well. He looked terrible, she said. Perhaps he should take some leave. Richard thanked her but declined. He could not leave. Not now. Margaret lingered for a moment, then leaned closer. She spoke quietly, her voice barely audible over the machine noise. She said she knew what it was like to carry secrets that hurt. Everyone at Bletchley Park knew. They all lived with the knowledge of things they had seen in coup, decoded messages, attacks they could not prevent. Soldiers who would die because warning them would compromise the source. It was the price of their work. The burden they carried so that others would not have to. Richard nodded but said nothing. Margaret squeezed his shoulder gently and returned to her station. She meant well, but she did not know about Beaumont-sur-Loire. She did not know about the 5,000. August 14th, 1944 arrived. Richard sat at his desk and tried to focus on new intercepts. The clock on the wall moved with agonizing slowness. Morning became afternoon. 1,200 hours. 1,300 hours, 1,330 hours. In Beaumont-sur-Loire, people were finishing lunch. Children were playing. Shopkeepers were returning to their stores. Generaloberst Dietrich was arriving for his meeting, unaware that death was coming from the sky. 1,400 hours arrived. Richard stared at the clock. At that exact moment, German bombers were releasing their payloads over a French market town. Buildings were exploding. Streets were erupting in flame. People were dying, 5,000 of them, and Richard had done nothing. He excused himself and walked outside. Behind the huts, hidden from view, he vomited into the bushes. When he returned, pale and shaking, no one commented. At Bletchley Park, people learned not to ask questions. 3 hours later, confirmation came through intelligence channels. The bombing of Beaumont-sur-Loire had been successful from a German perspective. The town had been largely destroyed. Casualty estimates were still being compiled, but preliminary reports suggested thousands dead. Among the casualties, Generaloberst Erwin Dietrich and his entire staff. The German High Command was scrambling to replace one of their most capable strategists. Travis called Richard to his office. The older man's face was grave. He informed Richard that his work had contributed to a significant intelligence victory. Dietrich's death would save Allied lives in the coming months. The Enigma secret remained secure. Richard had performed his duty admirably under difficult circumstances. Richard asked about the civilian casualties. Travis was quiet for a moment, then said that war created situations where there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. Richard had helped make a decision that would ultimately save more lives than it cost. He should take some comfort in that. But Richard found no comfort. That night, he dreamed of fire falling from the sky. He dreamed of a town square filled with the dead. He dreamed of children who would never grow up, of families erased in an afternoon, of a church bell that would never ring again. When he woke, drenched in sweat, he knew the dreams would return. They would return every night for the rest of his life. In the following weeks, Richard continued his work at Bletchley Park. He broke codes with the same precision as before. His performance evaluations remained excellent. To anyone watching, he seemed unchanged, but something fundamental had broken inside him. He no longer saw letters and numbers when he worked. He saw lives hanging in the balance. Every decoded message was a choice. Every intercept was a moral equation with no good answer. September came, and the Allied advance continued across France. Paris was liberated. The German army was in retreat. The intelligence provided by Bletchley Park gave Allied commanders decisive advantages. Thousands of soldiers survived battles because their officers knew where the enemy was positioned. The Enigma secret remained secure because no one had warned Beaumont-sur-Loire. Richard learned that the final casualty count from the bombing was 4,847 dead and 1,203 wounded. The number should have brought some relief. It was less than 5,000. But Richard found himself fixating on the precision of it. Each number represented a name, a face, a life that had ended because he had remained silent. He began researching the town. In the Bletchley Park library, he found a gazetteer with a brief description. Market town, established in the 13th century, known for its pottery and wine. Before the war, it had been a popular destination for British tourists. One of his colleagues had actually visited there in 1937. She remembered the beautiful church, the friendly locals, the excellent restaurants. Richard wanted to know their names, all 4,147 of them. He wanted to know who they had been, what they had dreamed of, who they had loved. But there were no lists, no records. They had been erased by fire and high explosives, reduced to a casualty statistic in a classified intelligence report. In October, Richard requested a meeting with Commander Travis. He said he could no longer continue working at Bletchley Park. The work was affecting his mental state. He needed to be reassigned. Travis regarded him with something approaching sympathy. He said that many people experienced similar difficulties. The nature of intelligence work created moral burdens that combat soldiers never faced. But the work was too important. Richard's skills were too valuable. He would be given 2 weeks of leave to recover, but he was expected to return. Richard took the leave. He traveled to London and spent days walking the city streets, trying to outpace his thoughts. Everywhere he looked, he saw the faces of people who might die tomorrow because of something he decoded today. Every child reminded him of Beaumont-sur-Loire. Every laugh, every smile, every moment of ordinary life felt like something that could be erased by a decision made in a windowless hut in the English countryside. He returned to Bletchley Park as ordered, but he worked now with a different understanding. Mathematics had always been pure to him, objective, beautiful, the one certain thing in an uncertain world. But he had learned that mathematics could be wielded like a weapon, that equations could kill as surely as bullets, that sometimes the correct answer was also the most terrible one. The war continued. Richard continued breaking codes. More lives were saved by the intelligence. More lives were lost because the secret had to be protected. The balance sheet was positive, as Travis had said. More saved than lost. The mathematics was clear, but Richard had stopped believing in mathematics. In December 1944, he decoded an intercept that revealed the location of a German supply convoy. The convoy was transporting medical supplies to a field hospital treating wounded soldiers. It was also passing through a village that housed a munitions factory. RAF commanders requested authorization for a bombing run. The munitions factory was a legitimate target. The hospital supplies would be destroyed as collateral damage. Richard stared at the decoded message. Here it was again. The same choice. Destroy something of military value and accept civilian casualties, or let the target survive and prolong the war. He thought about the wounded German soldiers who would die without medical supplies. He thought about the Allied soldiers who would die if the munitions factory continued operating. He thought about the mathematics of it, the calculations that made human lives into variables. This time, Richard made a different choice. He filed the intercept in his completed work, but did not flag it as priority intelligence. The report went through normal channels, which meant it took 3 days to reach the appropriate commanders. By then, the convoy had already reached its destination. The bombing run was cancelled as no longer viable. Richard had saved German lives by doing nothing. He had violated his duty. He had compromised the war effort in a small way, but for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. He did it again 2 weeks later. Another intercept, another delayed report. This time it was a troop movement that went unbombed. Then again in January. A submarine position that was not reported quickly enough for an attack. Small acts of sabotage disguised as processing delays and bureaucratic inefficiency. Richard knew he was playing a dangerous game. If he was caught, he would face court-martial, possibly execution for treason, but he could not stop. Each delayed report was an atonement. Each life he saved by inaction was a counterweight to Beaumont-sur-Loire. He knew the mathematics no longer added up. He was causing more Allied casualties than he was preventing German ones. He was violating everything he had been taught about his duty. But duty had killed 4,147 people in a French market town, and Richard could not carry that weight anymore. In March 1945, his delays were finally noticed. A pattern recognition analyst identified inconsistencies in Richard's processing times. An investigation was launched. Richard was called to Travis's office along with 2 military police officers. The evidence was presented. 12 intercepts processed more slowly than his usual speed. 12 opportunities missed. 3 confirmed Allied casualties that might have been prevented. Travis asked if Richard had anything to say. Richard thought about lying, about claiming illness or fatigue or simple mistakes. But he was tired of calculations and deceptions. He told the truth. He explained about Beaumont-sur-Loire, about the 5,000, about the dreams that would not stop, about the moment when he realized that mathematics could no longer guide him because some equations were too terrible to solve. Travis listened without interruption. When Richard finished, the older man was quiet for a long time. Then he dismissed the military police officers. Alone with Richard, Travis spoke quietly. He said that Beaumont-sur-Loire haunted him too, that every person who worked in intelligence at this level carried similar burdens, that Richard was not unique in his suffering, only in his response to it. But Travis also said that Richard had broken faith with his duty, that his actions had cost lives, that personal morality could not be allowed to compromise military necessity. Richard would be dishonorably discharged. His work at Bletchley Park would be stricken from official records. He would be required to sign additional secrecy agreements and would face prosecution if he ever spoke of his work here. He would leave immediately. Richard left Bletchley Park that afternoon. He carried his few personal belongings in a single bag. As he walked through the gates for the last time, he looked back at the Victorian mansion and scattered huts where he had spent 4 years of his life, where he had helped win a war, where he had learned that winning sometimes meant sacrificing the innocent. The war ended 3 months later. Germany surrendered. The casualties were counted. Historians would later estimate that code-breaking intelligence shortened the war by 2 to 4 years and saved millions of lives. The work done at Bletchley Park would be recognized as one of the most important intelligence achievements in human history. Richard learned this from newspapers, like everyone else. His name appeared in no honors lists. His work received no recognition. Officially, he had never been there. He returned to Cambridge and tried to resume his academic career, but found he could no longer work with pure mathematics. The numbers reminded him too much of lives reduced to variables. He became a school teacher instead, instructing children in basic arithmetic and geometry. His students found him kind but distant, as if his thoughts were always somewhere else. He never married. He never spoke about the war. At night, he still dreamed of fire falling from the sky. In 1974, the British government began declassifying information about Bletchley Park. Richard read the revelations with interest. The world was finally learning about Enigma, about the codebreakers, about the secret war that had been won with mathematics and brilliance. Survivors of Bletchley Park were interviewed. Books were written. Heroes were recognized. Richard remained silent. His discharge had been dishonorable. His contribution to the war effort had been officially erased. But more than that, he had no desire to be celebrated for what he had done. Other code breakers could claim their glory. Richard knew the price that had been paid for that glory. He knew about the choices that had no good answers. He knew about 4,147 names that would never be remembered. In his 70s, Richard developed cancer. As he lay dying in a Cambridge hospital, a visitor came to see him. It was Edward Travis, now retired, aged, but still sharp-eyed. Travis said he had been following Richard's life from a distance. He wanted Richard to know that Beaumont-sur-Loire had not been forgotten by everyone, that the sacrifice of those people had meaning, that their deaths had contributed to ending the war. Richard looked at his former commander and asked if Travis truly believed that. Travis hesitated, then admitted he did not know. Perhaps it was a necessary sacrifice. Perhaps it was simply a tragedy that happened to have strategic value. History would judge. All they could do was live with the choices they had made. Richard died 3 days later. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his career as a teacher, and his work for the government during the war, details unspecified. Nothing about Bletchley Park, nothing about Enigma, nothing about the 5,000. The decoded messages that Richard had worked on remained in classified archives. The intelligence reports derived from them showed only results, not the moral calculations behind them. To military historians studying the records, Beaumont-sur-Loire was merely one incident among thousands. A German general killed in a bombing, a strategic victory, a successful operation. Only Richard had known what that success really meant. He had carried the weight of it alone for 30 years. And when he died, that knowledge died with him. The 5,000 dead of Beaumont-sur-Loire became what they had always been to everyone except Richard. Numbers in a casualty report, variables in an equation, necessary sacrifices in a war that had to be won. But somewhere in the mathematics that Richard had once loved and later learned to fear, a question remained unanswered. If 5,000 lives could be sacrificed for strategic advantage, where did the calculations end? At what point did the protection of secrets become more important than the protection of the innocent? When did victory become indistinguishable from atrocity? Richard had spent 30 years searching for the answer. He had never found it. The equation remained unsolved, as perhaps it was always meant to remain. Some problems in mathematics had no solution. Some choices had no right answer. Some burdens had to be carried until death brought release. The code had been broken, the secret had been kept, the war had been won. And Richard Ashford, the man who had saved millions by sacrificing thousands, died alone in a hospital room, still dreaming of fire falling from a clear blue sky on a summer afternoon in France. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more incredible tales from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. History has countless stories waiting to be told, and your support helps us bring them to light.